The Ask the Experts platform is a monthly segment that offers an opportunity for Namibian journalists to engage noted experts in one-on-one discussions on the COVID-19 pandemic. Journalists get to pose questions to experts in various sectors to ensure that they are equipped with the necessary information to better inform their readers, listeners, and viewers. COVID-19 is our common enemy. Together, we can defeat it. Proudly brought to you by the Namibia Media Trust and the DW Academy.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to yet another session of hashtag Ask the Experts, a platform where we engage experts in different fields, considering all things COVID-19 related. And this platform is made possible by the Namibia Media Trust and also the DW Academy. Now, today we'll be talking about practicing business in the new normal. And it's a discussion and a topic of discussion on everybody's lips. And today we want to hear from the sources themselves. I'm your moderator, Nina Katangana, and our experts today is Rowland Brown, who is an economist, and he's also the co-founder of Cirrus Capital. And then we'll also be speaking to Pinehas Shikulo, but I think a lot of people know him by his artist name, which is Zulu Boy from Amadeus Floor, but he's going to join us today in his capacity as an entrepreneur. And then, of course, we have our lovely Salma Moses, who is our sign language interpreter for the day. So good morning and welcome to everybody. Also, just a reminder that the session will be uploaded on the NMT YouTube page. So if you are unable to follow through the whole discussion, you can catch the entire session on YouTube. All right. So Roland, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. And also Pinehas, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on this platform. Roland, just from the perspective of an economist, how would you say the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the Namibian business sector?
Well, thank you very much for having me this morning. I think it's an interesting topic that we're here to discuss. I think COVID has had an impact across the board. And, it's always interesting when people ask me sort of from an economic perspective, what we think about something, because, the study of economics is just the study of all the different parts of an economy. So basically how people and collections of people, whether it's in the form of businesses or similar, interact, and how the various activity that those people undertake expands, contracts, changes, etc. over time. And if you look at COVID, I mean, it's had such far-reaching implications that there's very, very few people or group of people, institutions similar, that haven't been affected by it. And I think importantly, that won't change anytime soon. I mean, COVID isn't going away. COVID is here to stay for the long term, I think. I don't think that we're going to see any kind of cure or measure that will stop it from reappearing, every year for, the foreseeable future, multiple times a year, etc. And it will continue to have an impact on the world and how we go about our business. And I think that slowly we will kind of adapt to it, but it will be there in the background or the foreground in perpetuity, in my view. So this obviously then means that we need to find ways to live with it. And I think that this has been a kind of critical consideration for us from the beginning of the pandemic, is to say, this is unlikely to disappear. So what is the manner in which we can adapt, but at the same time, people can get on with the very important business of their lives and livelihoods? And how can we ensure that despite this global pandemic, despite this virus that is now here to stay, how do people go about continuing to put food on their tables, continuing to ensure that tomorrow is better than today, and so on and so forth? And I think that that's really the big challenge that we face from a planning policy perspective. And ultimately, this comes through in terms of the economic impact on people's lives and on the bigger, broader macroeconomy.
Thank you, Roland. We'll get into the impact of the impact on people's lives. But I see that Pinehas has joined us. Pinehas, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on another session of hashtag Ask the Experts. I want to know, you're here today in your capacity as an entrepreneur, and I want to know what your business experience, has been since the start of this pandemic, which was, last year, 2020 in March. Well, it seems we may have lost Pinehas there. Roland, while we wait to reconnect with him and get this technology working with us, we were talking about the impact, that this current economic climate has on the average Namibian. What does that look like at household level? Because we have seen people, unfortunately, get retrenched. We have seen people lose their jobs, and also because we've seen a new strain of the virus, come forth, a strain that is, much deadlier than the one we initially were introduced to. People are also losing their lives. So there's breadwinners that are no longer in the household. So what does that look like? The impact look like on a household level?
Yeah, I think to understand what's happening at household level, one needs to sort of look at it in the context of the broader picture. So what we've seen as a result of the virus and then the various measures that the world has put into place around that is a dramatic kind of reduction in the amount of economic activity that's being undertaken globally. So this, fewer people traveling for tourism purposes, for example, less beverages being produced, as a result of, less demand for beverages because of alcohol bans or because people aren't going on holiday and consuming as much alcohol as they did previously and things of that nature. And this has had an impact on the income streams of businesses that then ultimately employ people and has therefore filtered down into household incomes through this. And, where you have sort of advanced economies with large buffers, large numbers of taxpayers, big, broad economic foundations, with 80-90% of the population, the working age population actually employed, contributing, to those state buffers and similar, one can offset this to some extent. And you've seen various schemes around the world trying to offset the fact that household incomes have come under pressure as a result of this sort of combination of shocks. In countries such as our own, where you don't have those big buffers, either at state level, in many instances at business level, especially after 5 or 6 years of no growth and a very difficult business environment generally, and very limited buffers at household levels as well. This loss of income has had a very, very material impact on many people's lives and livelihoods. And the fact that there simply aren't those kind of reserves on which to fall back when you have a shock like this just leaves people very vulnerable. And I think that we see that playing out, kind of day in, day out. If people are unable to go to work, either because they've been retrenched or because of lockdowns or whatever it is, it's not that there's an offset somewhere else. It's not that they get transfers from the state for months on end. It's not that they've got either money in the bank or in many instances even food in the cupboard at home. And the implication of that is that you see families going hungry, you see children with issues around malnutrition, et cetera, and that can reverberate for an extended period of time. I mean, that's not something that we do away with tomorrow. And I think from that perspective, we need to be very cautious around the policy stance that we take with regards to this virus and our response there to in Namibia, and we need to make sure that our response is suitable for our environment. Where we've got a younger population that's less vulnerable than many of the older populations of the Western world, for example, we need to take that into account. And then we also need to take into account what kind of livelihood offset we can bring into play in the event that there's a loss of income at family or at household level. And I think that this is something that that's a balance that we need to strike. Going forward, it's very concerning. I mean, we've had 5 years of no growth in the build up to this COVID shock. we had seen both increasing unemployment, but also deterioration in the quality of employment over that period. So, people moving away from cash incomes, or, not by choice, of course, but a reduction in cash incomes, more in-kind income, so increases in subsistence farming, reduction in employment in construction, these types of things. And the implication of that is that already, many of these buffers had been worn away. And the big question going forward is sort of what turns the situation, that we go from shedding jobs to actually creating jobs for the majority of the population, so that people can build back these buffers, people can sort of turn around the sort of devastating economic and life impact of this COVID event.
Thanks, Roland. Pinehas, can you hear us? Are you there?
Yes, I can hear you now. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm good. How are you doing?
We are doing well. It's a tough time, but we are coping. We are quite doing well. Thank you.
Yeah. I think for anybody that knows you, either as an artist or an entrepreneur, if they've been keeping an eye on you, well, from my perspective anyhow, it seems that you're really pushing and doing well. And I want to know, and as an entrepreneur, your business experience, what it has been, since the start of this pandemic, which was, last year in March.
I will. First of all, I will say thank you so much for having me here. It's always an honor to come to this discussion and share my stories and and talk about my experiences. We are fortunate and we are thankful that although this pandemic has hit the country in all the world in many ways, we quite of surviving well. Since last year, we started with a small initiative of testing the market of how can our products get into the Namibian market, and the response has been amazing. Since we started with the socks, since also the Standard Bank came in with the buy brick socks, so far the nation has been responding. And then this year we expanded to opening up a store, which we started in town, and then we moved to Grove Mall. But so far the experience has been amazing. The people have supported, and now people are starting to realize that they need to support their own. But in our capacity, in our case, we have expanded, and we are also into collaboration where we collaborated with other Namibian local branch, which increases the support of our brand. But it has been a tough year, but we are thankful that at least people come and have noticed the brand and came and they are still supporting till today. Yeah.
And that's something that I was going to ask you, because in the midst of what seems to be tough economic times and a hard economic climate, your business has seemed to, continuously grow. Like you mentioned, you had Standard Bank come on board as a sponsor. You started out with Gweri socks that everybody knows. I don't think there's a Namibian that doesn't have a pair of Gweri socks. And then you moved on to, expand the brand Gweri Vintage, and you got this pop-up shop, which is in a space which is considered to be, one of Namibia's prime retail spaces, which is Grove Mall, and you have this pop-up shop for Gweri Vintage there. How did you manage to do that in a time when things are, can be a bit tough for an entrepreneur, especially a young entrepreneur, because your business is also, still a baby?
Yes, as I said throughout my conversation, as I said throughout my introduction, we tested the market. Testing the market was, we had pop-up shops which helped us analyze what could work and what could not work. At the beginning, it was first a gamble because we needed to find who our niche market, who our target market. We started with Venel Park, which didn't quite do well. We went to Marua Mall, also didn't quite pick up well. But then when we went to the Grove Mall, we found out that that's exactly where our market is. And through our customers through the Grove Mall, they really came to understand the brand and our principles of how we want to expand. So we are so fortunate that people started to realize the brand, and from there, that's how we managed to speak to the management of the mall and also find a better pricing for us, because obviously the rent, everybody keeps on asking, the rent is not expensive. Then we asked the management of what could be a benefit for us as a small business. We are still a baby, as you are saying. We are still not even 10 years in this industry. But what will be the best price to give us as a young Namibian shop? And then we agreed on a better price, and then it worked with us. And the relationship is quite well with the management of the mall. So I always tell people relationship matters even during this time. I know everyone is not doing so well, but a relationship and being realistic is the best way right now. Yeah.
Yeah, no, indeed. Roland, you touched on this just a bit earlier, but I want to know, do you think there's a need for more Namibians to consider, entering into the business sector amidst this, economic climate?
I think there's always a need for that. I think, there's so few really inspiring stories, such as the one that you've just heard about, real Namibian products, entrepreneurs doing things, taking risks and all that goes with that. And I think that, over the past sort of decade or so, we haven't really seen nearly as much of that type of activity as the country, the economy, and the people of the country need. So I definitely think that it's something that we need to do going forward. And I think, we need to find ways to make it easier for people to do that. I'm sure that we can all tell stories of some of the challenges that we've faced, and some of them are natural challenges. Some of them are, just challenges that exist, as a result of the world being as it is. But a lot of them are also man-made challenges. And, we really need to try to remove those man-made challenges to the degree possible, so that more people can start businesses, can, make an income for themselves, a livelihood for themselves, and aren't as reliant on, big old existing businesses for employment and for income. And I think that really is something that we've been sort of talking about for a long time, that we really need to make sure that we embrace entrepreneurship, we encourage entrepreneurship, and we make it easy for entrepreneurs to succeed to the degree possible. And, I think that it's critical. And perhaps now this shock that we've experienced over the last few years will help to get that message through. What we know is that the big old established businesses are not suddenly going to be creating hundreds and hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of jobs over the next year or two. And at the same time, the families of all the people who have lost jobs, the families of people who didn't have jobs pre-COVID, which were already numerous, still need to have food put on their table, still need to ensure that the kids can go to school, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's of vital importance that we make it as easy as possible for those people, those families, to ensure that they can do whatever they need to do in order to feed their families with as few restrictions as possible and as few limitations as possible, and where possible, as much support from public and private sector to build them up, encourage them, create opportunities, avail funding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in order to make it easier for those businesses and those individuals to grow and improve their lot in life.
Yeah, I think one thing that COVID-19 really has shown us, in terms of the business sector, is that services, businesses, and even some positions within these businesses can, become redundant in the blink of an eye. And perhaps what, some people may be struggling with is deciding, to start their own business, because as you mentioned at the beginning of your statement, is that starting your own business, yes, it might be a good idea, but it's also risky. But then there's, the stability now of the 9 to 5, but you don't know how long that stability is going to be there with what's going on currently. So what would you say, Roland, are the pros and cons of, starting your own business versus staying in your 9 to 5?
Well, we started our business 4.5 years ago, and I can tell you that there are very few pros of doing it. My experience is that being employed elsewhere and having a certain income every month and not carrying all that risk, all that responsibility and so on, most days looks pretty good compared to the alternative. So we started our business in the middle of a recession, I think very much bordering on a depression, if not crossing that border. And just as we thought there was maybe some light at the tunnel, COVID came along. So it certainly hasn't made life easy. But I think, you know, in the long term, there's a little bit more to it than that. And I think, you know, the people, generally speaking, you know, want to do something that adds value to more than just themselves, adds some value to society, leaves a bit of a legacy behind, and so on. And I think, you know, for us personally, the things that we're most proud of in terms of what we've done is to, you know, through this COVID period, not just maintain our staff, but actually hire a few extra people. We've picked up people that lost jobs elsewhere, and we've tried to find a space for them in our mix, and so on. And, you know, I think that we see huge value in that goes beyond the kind of personal feelings of just, you know, or sort of frustration and so on with some of the challenges that we face. I think for me, a kind of critical message around a lot of this is that starting businesses is tough. It's really tough. And that's the natural order of things is tough. I think, as Pinehas mentioned, you know, it takes time to figure out your spot, your groove, you know, which mall is the right mall for you, which product is the right product, et cetera, et cetera. It takes time. You need to be resilient. You need to roll with the punches, and you know it's difficult to get it right, and it comes with a lot of downside. When you do get it right, which I hope we will do one day, I think it should be very rewarding, and to see, you know, the contribution that you make to the broader picture, I think is very rewarding. But at the same time, I come back to this point again and again, because I think it is so fundamental and so important. Because it's so tough to start businesses, because it's so tough to make things work, we need to remove as many of the man-made impediments as we can. We need to make sure that, you know, if you want to start a business, if you have that entrepreneurial flair, if you have that desire to do something different, to either leave a job, or perhaps you don't have a job, but to take that risk, to put that effort into starting a business, we need to try and make sure that as many of your challenges as possible are natural challenges, not man-made challenges. And I think that that's really a very fundamental thing for us. And, you know, we've seen it now through the COVID period. We have a small venture portfolio that we put a little bit of money into, you know, things that we think have potential to add value, you know, beyond what we do as our core business. And in that, I mean, we've seen it over the last year. Projects that should have taken 9 months to get off the ground to start generating income are 18 months in, probably still, you know, 2 years away from generating income. And it's not great for us as the people putting in some of the capital, but for the entrepreneur who's really putting everything on the line to make this business work. And he's being told, you know, sorry, we can't help you with that invoice from entity X because of COVID. Sorry, we can't help you with that license because of COVID. Sorry. And this person is sitting, having, you know, put most of their own money and a lot of their own time and so on into it, and not being in a position for them to generate revenue from it. It's devastating. And those are the types of challenges that we really just need to remove if we want to see more entrepreneurship kind of coming out of this COVID period, and more people being able to, you know, both help themselves, create jobs for themselves, create jobs for their communities, contribute to the broader economy, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, Pinehas, although the trajectory of your business seems to be, you know, on the up and up, of course, I know sure that it hasn't been without challenges. What are some of the challenges that you've experienced as a young entrepreneur, specifically during this COVID-19 period?
Just what Rowland said about the challenges. I also just wanted to add in a bit also, then I can also just get to your topic. You see, before COVID, came, which was around being speculated around the whole globe, I took a small initiative of collecting water and donating it to the people living, living outside of town or living where they don't have facilities and water. But through that research or through that process, I came to discover something that there's a lot of need, there's a lot of help that we need as entrepreneurs or as whoever needs to go to our people and educate the people and make sure they understand the information. Through the journey of my entrepreneurship, my most fundamental part was having the skills. And the reason why we tell people skills development is the biggest. I finished my university, but that's just the paper that I'm using to present, but I need my skills so that I can produce whatever, any stuff that I'm producing. So I think we need to sort of understand now that it's high time maybe we start investing into our skills development, because when you hear stories around Katutura, there are kids that were raised by their parents where their mother used to sell kapana, using her hands to sell, or maybe the father used to weld. This is our old skills, and imagine people have been living through this time even before COVID. So which means they're already tough. So when COVID came, they are already through that process. So it also goes back to my story, like the challenge has been there before COVID. Trust me, it has been there because it was difficult to manufacture, and it was difficult for the dreams to go all out. So right now, when COVID came, it's just another problem. But through entrepreneurship, we have learned to go through all these things. We have learned to find ways through these things. As Roland said, between having a job or opening up a business, well, opening up a business is a lot of risk, and that's what our daily challenges is every day, because you don't know if clients are coming to your shop. But you need to find a way of how do you tell the people that please come buy my products at the shop. So challenges are every day, risks are every day. It's just a matter of time that you need to push and find solutions to that. But as I said, right now, our nation is waking up and everybody's supporting local now, which is the biggest thing right now. And I think we are just at the stage where things might be getting better. For our local products to be, or local manufacturers to, and stuff to be made locally. Yeah.
Thank you. Roland, there are many circumstances that can contribute, to the unproductivity in the business environment as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. That may be, absenteeism due to people catching the virus and then, having to get well, or even just having to isolate if you've been in contact with somebody, and also, of course, the premature deaths that we're seeing happening. What are the additional issues that, you think we may further see arise that would have a direct economic impact?
So yeah, I mean, there's if you look at the kind of nature of the COVID shock, there were three components to it. So the first one is what the economists call an external demand shock. That's basically just that demand for Namibian goods and services from abroad fell dramatically. So the two that we felt the most directly, I think, are probably demand for our diamonds, which is one of our core sources of hard currency earnings with which we buy the things that we import. And the second one was tourism. So basically from both of those, there was less money coming into the country than would normally have been the case. And then not just that, but then internally that money, also the changing hands of the money that was coming in slowed quite dramatically as well. So people were kind of scared by the pandemic, quite understandably, and weren't sure what the impact would be on their businesses, on their households, etc. And people sort of slowly put the brakes on expenditure generally. And so as a result of that, money was changing hands a bit less as well. But now this is all interlinked. So the second kind of core shock was an internal supply shock. And that was basically a shock where producing goods and services domestically became challenging. And there were two kind of core components to that. So the first one was the lockdowns that we experienced last year. So if you were considered non-essential, I have a major problem with this idea of essential and non-essential, because it talks about the product that you produce. And, we talked about, beverages and like alcoholic beverages, or actually beverages in general, were non-essential. So I guess that may be the case that they're non-essential, but for the people who are doing the work to produce those beverages, that the income from it is absolutely essential. The same, when we consider that restaurants are non-essential. Well, for the people who rely on income from the wages that they earn and the tips that they earn working in restaurants, the income is absolutely essential. So yes, maybe serving food is not essential, but it's a very, very one-dimensional assessment of what essential is. But in any event, that ability to produce domestically was curtailed by lockdowns and the fact that certain portions of the economy were considered to be non-essential and not able to go about their business. That's part one of that. Part two of it is the medical side of it that you mentioned. So absenteeism, people falling sick and so on. Now, one can kind of split these into man-made and natural problems. So I think the natural problem is absenteeism. If people get sick and so on, that's a natural problem. There's not something that we can really do about that. But the lockdowns are certainly a man-made problem. And I think, we by trying to take a sort of view from up high and say that this is essential, that's not essential, and so on, we pretend that we have a much deeper understanding of what actually happens as a result of that macro activity and how that filters into real people's lives than we actually do. And, I think in my mind, at least, our responses should have been much more along the lines of, we need to give people the option. We need to put a lot of effort into explaining what the risks are and so on. But at the end of the day, the mother with a hungry kid at home needs to be able to decide, is it better for her to not work and that kid be hungry, or go to work and run the risk of catching a virus? And now, if the person has that choice, it's a horrible choice, right? It's not a choice you would wish on anyone, but that was the kind of reality that people were sitting with. And the same with the construction industry, for example. Young men that trade physical labor for income in the construction industry, were not particularly at risk of dying from COVID, being young. But we took a decision, from up high that we shouldn't let those people go to work because of the risk associated with COVID. Meanwhile, we don't fully understand the risk of a loss of income for those households. And many of those men may have been the sole breadwinner for the household, and maybe there's not a lot of food or money in the bank and similar. So we need to allow people that have a deeper understanding of their own situation to make it informed decisions. And often those decisions are horrible. We have to admit that. But still, people are in a better position to make those decisions themselves than we are from up high. Then the third shock, which is I think the most relevant one now, is an internal demand shock, which is basically the shock that causes that circulation of money to slow. So that's a shock where locally consumers are either not as able to consume as was the case previously because of losses of income, because of erosion of savings, et cetera, or are choosing not to spend because of uncertainty around future income and similar. That's the shock that will reverberate now for quite a while. If you take the wholesale and retail trade industry, for example, it was one of the biggest employers in the country. One of the other biggest employers in the country is the tourism industry. Both of those industries have been really severely affected by COVID, and we don't have exact statistics, but we think that something in the region of 40,000 people have lost jobs in those two industries. Just in those two industries, and that's not the entirety of the job losses, But those two industries, that loss of cash income in those two industries will mean that less money gets spent in the shops. It will mean that there's less money circulating again within the economy. And that will take quite a long time to resolve. And really, it will only be resolved once household incomes start to pick up again. And then the big question is, well, what is going to drive that recovery in household incomes? So the COVID shock will still last for quite a long time.
No, definitely. Roland, at the start of this pandemic, of course, it caught the whole world, off guard. We saw governments sort of trying to scramble to aid or save this rapidly failing economy. And one of the solutions that they came up with was this COVID-19 relief fund that was supposed to sort of aid businesses in different sectors. I mean, the EIF had one, where conservancies would benefit from this fund. But I just want to know, from your point of view, what is the efficacy of this COVID-19 fund been?
Well, it's a tricky question because, one must bear in mind that the Namibian economy produces something like 200 billion worth of value addition every year. And, if you take, there are 52 weeks in a year, so 5 weeks of lockdown is 10% of that. So that's 20 billion within just that hard lockdown, that 5-week lockdown. So if you consider that the quantum of the offset that you need to sort of look at in order to make up for that loss of economic activity over a period of time like that is in that, say, let's even assume it's half of that. Say that half of the economy was still functioning through that period, which is not correct, but let's assume it. I mean, then you're still talking about a 10 billion offset that you need to make up for that loss. So I think, most of these initiatives were noble, and I think that the intent behind them is obviously good. But we need a sense of proportion. 100 million or 200 million fund is a big fund, but it pales in comparison to the 10 or 20 billion of lost economic activity. The hard reality is that for an economy to function, you need lots and lots of people to be doing their utmost to produce goods and services and so on. And if you curtail that, a handful of companies, a handful of individuals, a handful of good Samaritans really can't offset it. You need the majority of the people within an economy to be doing their utmost in order to see those sort of macro benefits. And all of these things, the intent may have been good, and I'm sure it was in every instance, but the quantum is just insufficient to really offset the quantum of the shock that we experienced.
You mentioned earlier how, we sort of classify the government has classified what is considered an essential service and what is not an essential service, and maybe how that needs to be relooked. So my question is, do you believe that, the industries or the sectors that did receive from this national COVID relief funds were the correct industries to aid or assist?
Well, in all honesty, I don't really believe in picking sectors. I think, whether you're producing socks or you're producing, maize meal, you're adding value to an economy. You're adding value to people's lives. You're putting money on families' tables and so on. So to say we're going to stop, big sections of the economy functioning and then we're going to pick which ones are allowed to get support, for me, doesn't really make sense. When we were looking at the COVID relief measures previously, one of the things that we were cautious of is we felt that it was very, very unfair if households that did absolutely nothing wrong carry the brunt of this shock, and that if we're providing relief, we should try to provide relief in such a manner that we offset the shock at household level rather than at company level. And the idea behind this was specifically linked to the likes of tourism, where if you take the income statement of most tourism companies, you've got your revenue line and your cost of sales. So revenue fell dramatically last year. So most of the tourists that were coming canceled, asked for refunds, etc. And the cost of sales, which is, the food and so on associated with those tourists, also then dropped. So your revenue's pretty much gone. Your cost of sales is pretty much gone as well. But the remaining expenses that you sit with are usually in the tourism industry, some utilities and things like that, but that also drops dramatically. So you're not keeping all your lodges open and things like that and burning the lights as usual and so on. And then debt costs, if you've borrowed in order to build your tourism facility, which there were various measures put in place in order to help with that from the central bank and the commercial banks. And then employment costs. And what we said is that, in order for many of these lodges, these tourism facilities and similar to survive, they're going to retrench heavily. And in the short term, that's a terrible thing to do. In the long term, it's probably actually the right thing to do, because it means that there'll still be long-term employment. If those businesses go under because of COVID, then there's no long-term employment. So you keep people employed for a year or two, but ultimately they lose their jobs. And that's not good over the long term for obvious reasons. But we said that's deeply unjust for the people who lose their jobs in order for the business to survive. And then the idea was to say, well, rather than providing support to those businesses, provide support to the households that are likely to be most severely affected by this. So where you've got this big loss of income. And I think that's quite a lot more kind of justifiable, especially where it's an externally or an exogenous shock, and a shock that generates from outside of Namibia. And it's not one of our own making. In my mind, the one of our own making is a bit different, where we go into lockdown, because there I think you can't really take away with one hand and give back, a fraction thereof with the other and think that you're doing the right thing. But where you have this external shock, then I think that was the right approach to take. Now, whether that actually happened or not, I'm not sure. I don't think that fund and that plan was actually implemented that successfully, but I haven't followed it that closely.
All right, thank you. We'll get into the effects of lockdown also just in a bit. But Pinehas, I want to know how the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, has affected you, your psychological health, and also from a business perspective, because for a business to thrive, not only does the business need to be healthy, but the people who work in the business, who serve the business, who own the business, need to be healthy as well, need to be in tip-top shape to ensure its success. So how has your psychological health been affected by this pandemic?
As I said earlier, we have been in the pandemic before COVID. So, well, the health challenges are, it's an everyday thing, but mostly what I look at is the positive side. I look at when people come to the shop, that shows that there's positive in this project. And even the employees, I know sometimes there's a day or two, one or two, we don't make sales, but I always talk to them and always motivate them that, come on guys, we will get there, and we will have to go through this. So every day is a challenge, it's a mind challenge, but keeping yourself positive is always the best medicine. And I'm thankful for also the people that are around me, my partners and everybody around me. They're always positive. Even things are not going well, there's always some positive news, which keeps us going every day. Yeah.
Awesome. Roland, you mentioned, talked lightly about lockdown earlier, and we know that obviously government had to put these regulations in place to ensure that the further spread of the virus is slowed down, and to a point, hopefully, eventually, one day will be completely eliminated. But with these restrictions, you're shaking your head. But with these restrictions, with a curfew, with businesses not being able to operate certain hours, with liquor not being able to be sold, et cetera, these regulations have had a direct impact on the business sector. Now, my question is, what practices can small business owners put into place to protect their businesses, from succumbing to this as a result?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, COVID will never go away. I think that it will be a lesser issue going forward as more and more of the population is got some form of immunity to it, so on, but it's never going to go away. I think that the lockdown measures and so on, initially, I mean, I think my view is pretty well known on this. I think we locked down far too early. I think when we had 6 or 7 cases in the country, to go into a hard lockdown was a big mistake. And I think we used up a lot of the reserves that we had early on in terms of household reserves, government reserves, business reserves, etc., for virtually no benefit. At the same time, the counter argument is that we didn't really know what we were dealing with at that point. And the big kind of uncertainty on Namibia was what will the co-mortality be like for a population that's got a very high HIV/AIDS prevalence? And will that combine with COVID mean that we have an abnormally high mortality rate? Within weeks, the information from South Africa was coming through that, because they were kind of ahead of us in terms of their real first wave, that there isn't a big co-mortality or comorbidity risk there. And as a result of that, I think that we could have taken a very different approach early on. That was a much less blanket approach. But it's difficult, right? I mean, I don't envy the people who are in the decision-making chairs having to make a call on what to do here. After that, I think that we actually moved from that first hard lockdown to be much, much more sensible than many other countries in the region, particularly South Africa and Angola, that have been way more extreme. And I think, you know, maybe not the first or second, but certainly the third or fourth press conference that the president held, he mentioned livelihoods. And that was a critical thing for us from early on, is that we were acting as if these health measures had as if there was no cost associated with them, as if, you know, by going into these hard lockdowns, we were just saving lives and there was no cost associated with that. And we felt that that was an incorrect conclusion, and that there's actually a very material cost associated with it from a livelihood perspective. So when the president started talking about livelihoods and we started trying to balance lives and livelihoods more, we think that then we were moving into the right direction. Now, the fact that we haven't had any further hard lockdowns, even when we had that third big real wave, I'd say the first real wave that we had, I think shows that there's now a much, much better understanding of the life versus livelihood trade-off. And I think that that's good. I think we now, going forward, there will be a fourth wave, I have no doubt about it. And when that hits, I think that the chances of us doing the same deep damage to livelihoods that we did with the first sort of minor wave is very slim. So from a business perspective, that's very good news. From a household income perspective, that's very good news. It pushes the responsibility away from policymakers and sort of collectives to individuals, though. And I think that's something that has been not that well understood, and something that needs to be sort of emphasized when the opportunity exists to do that, which is that, you know, that third wave was a wave of our own making in many ways. And it was something that, you know, it was a mistake made by many members of the public by being damn reckless about the risks associated with this. And, you know, there were lots of examples of that I won't go into. And I think, you know, we need to take it quite seriously as a public still. I think, you know, the fact that there's a lot of vaccine skepticism and things like that is problematic when it comes to this. But I mean, the public needs to take responsibility for this, not devolve responsibility to policymakers if we want to balance this life versus livelihood situation to the best of our ability. So the risk when it comes to businesses, really, I think, is that meta risk has dissipated to a large degree. However, there's still a latent and a risk that I think existed long before COVID, which is a small shrinking economy that's shedding jobs where household incomes are under pressure, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's really the risk that businesses need to mitigate against. So I think the critical things are, you know, especially for smaller businesses. For big businesses, it's have a war chest. You know, make sure that you have some buffers available to you. For smaller businesses that tend not to have those war chests, smaller businesses tend to be reinvesting the whole time. They tend to be building up their product, their inventories, etc., marketing, branding, etc. They don't sit with a lot of reserves. And I think there the critical thing is remain dynamic. Just you have to be small and dynamic. If you're small, you have to be dynamic. If you can't change, move, turn on a dime, it's going to be very difficult to survive. Then the second thing is that brand, and I think that this is where Pinehas has done so well, amongst other things, is in building that brand that people have a lot of sort of respect for, a lot of loyalty towards, want to support. There's I think a lot of goodwill towards Namibian brands where we can see honest entrepreneurs trying to do things that our country so desperately needs. I think people want to support that. So building that brand, I think, is the other thing that's of great importance. And then if you can build some reserves or have some access to capital, for those bad months where you're not covering your costs and things like that, I think that's a big plus, but it's very difficult to do.
Thanks, Roland. Pinehas, I want to know, what you would say is the best business model to adopt for small businesses, for entrepreneurs who are thinking about, opening up their own businesses to ensure that they succeed. And I also want to know, do you think that the opportunity pool for businesses has declined during this COVID-19 pandemic era, or is there more opportunities for business right now?
I think I would like to say that you need to start small. Looking at how we started with the little funds we had, and also you need to do your research well. A lot of entrepreneurs, in most cases, if it's conversation that we have every day, is you have an idea and then you want to go look for funds. First of all, you need to do the research. If you don't do your research well, then it becomes difficult for you to sustain in the game, because you need to understand the market, you need to understand what the people like. Before we entered with our products, we had to analyze the situation. What do the people need? There was a whole trend of people wearing colorful socks. We're like, people are wearing colorful socks. How about we tap in this market? What is the outcome of it? We are on the streets trying to sell our products, and the outcome was well executed. So people need to understand, you need to analyze the situation. You need to understand that what do the people need? For business opportunities, there are a lot of opportunities that are out there. And I always tell people, every day we are eating food. Every day we need to eat, to consume something. That's also another business you can look at. In most cases, people look at things that are far from them. And sometimes it becomes difficult for them to take up or go along with the whole way. Do a business that is speaking to you. Do a business that you are willing to take 100 hours or how many hours to be on that business. And in most cases, people, what most entrepreneurs, the experience that I have with the conversation is that once they see someone is starting up a business, I think Zulu Boy is doing well with the socks. I also want to start socks. But it's not that initial idea. It's more of doing research and analyzing the product. And do the people really need that product? Or are you just doing a business because you want to flourish, or you want to show the people that you are doing a business? But to be honest, opportunities are still there. And I'm going to emphasize that skills development, opportunities are still there. I'm 100% sure about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Roland, earlier, Pinehas said that, COVID was there even prior to COVID that we experienced in 2021. And you also mentioned at the start of our conversation how even 5 years prior to, last year when COVID-19 pandemic hit us, the economy was already shaky, and now for businesses that are up and coming, or people that are deciding between, starting a business, remaining employed, etc. In an ideal world, with an economy that was already shaky 5 years ago and not knowing what the future holds, as you mentioned, you believe that, COVID-19 is going to be around for a very long time. In an ideal world, what is the economic solution to the issues that we face currently?
So, I mean, we've said this now for 5 or 6 years, and I think the message is slowly getting through to the policymaking spheres. That message is that there's only 4 components of GDP, right? So if we want to see growth, those 4 components are the only places that we have to look. The first one is household consumption. Households can only consume, in line with their income plus whatever they can borrow. Now, our households have already borrowed pretty much as they can on average. So we have a household debt to disposable income of close to 100%. That's like kind of global maximums. If you look around the world, there are very few places where, households can borrow more than that sustainably. So it's basically household expenditure is a factor of how much goes in, is how much can go out again. So from that perspective, household consumption is not going to be the catalyst for growth. We need first that money to be coming into households, which requires another catalyst. The second component is government expenditure. At the moment, our government is spending about 25%, between 20 and 25% more every year than it's collecting in income. So it's also racking up a lot of debt. And we've gone from having very little debt to having, close to not quite unsustainable levels, but certainly close to unsustainable levels of debt now in government. So government can't really spend more to drive growth. The third component is net exports. So that's exports minus imports. Now, when it comes to exports minus imports, it's kind of statistical growth. So if we import less, we see more growth, which is good if we're importing less because we're producing more domestically, but it's not good if we're importing less because households can't afford to buy things. Then it's a sign of a deteriorating standard of living. When it comes to, so both, but in either event, right, when it comes to imports, reducing imports or increasing exports, it requires some other catalyst for us to do that. It doesn't just happen on its own. And that catalyst, plus the catalyst that we need in order to have more household income, plus the catalyst that we need in order to have more income for government, is investment. So we're not going to see a recovery in this economy until we see a material change in investment. And actually what we've seen over the last few years is huge withdrawals of investment. So withdrawals of capital rather than investment of capital. And there's a number of reasons behind that. But I mean, it's basically, all comes down to the fact that investors don't think it's that easy to generate a return on their investment in Namibia. Now, when we talk about investors, and it took me longer than I care to admit to figure out how this was being interpreted when we talked about it. When we talked about investors 5 years ago or so, I think the majority of people thought that we were talking about foreigners with briefcases and pointy shoes. And we were sort of talking about selling the country to foreigners in order to get growth. And that's not the intention at all. And foreign investment is very important, but it's not as important when it comes to developing kind of grassroots opportunities as local investment is. And that local investment is things like, Gueri Vintage and similar. It's getting local entrepreneurship going, getting, local savings invested, not into cars, houses, Edcon accounts, things like that, but getting that money into starting local businesses, invested into starting local businesses, creating jobs for Namibian people, creating opportunities at that grassroots level to provide goods and services that Namibian people want and need and are willing to pay their hard-earned income for. And that's really, really critical. The high level, big, large scale investment is also important. Investment into mining activity, for example, is still good for the Namibian economy, but it does result in this kind of less inclusive growth, let's call it that. It's not, we talk about inclusive growth because, that's what uplifts people. GDP doesn't matter. GDP is, it's a kind of theoretical thing that economists do. It's an accounting exercise. What matters is, how does GDP translate to people's lives, and how are we actually improving people's lives as a result of the growth that we're seeing? And so the focus is globally has sort of moved away from growth generally to inclusive growth. But we talk about, sort of capital intensive growth like mining investment as if it's not inclusive. It is inclusive, it's just not as inclusive as grassroots developed growth. So that type of mining investment and similar is important, but the stuff that will really have an impact at household level is kind of grassroots domestic investment, grassroots domestic development. And that's why, you know, our company has the small venture portfolio I mentioned earlier, because we see, you know, if we've got a small amount of money that we can invest into a local entrepreneur's project, a local venture activity, the impact of that in terms of job creation, in terms of real people's lives, is so much greater than the theoretical stuff of going to Dubai to try to get, you know, somebody with billions of dollars to invest in a project that's going to be very capital intensive, going to the US, going to Germany to get big investment into, you know, very non-labor intensive, very high capital intensive industries like green hydrogen and so on. That doesn't have that impact at grassroots level that the country so desperately needs. So making entrepreneurship much easier, removing a lot of the unnecessary barriers, making the regulatory regime much less one-dimensional. At the moment, you know, a small asset manager gets regulated more or less the same as Old Mutual. Old Mutual's 100 years old. The small asset manager might be, you know, 1 year old. That is not encouraging that kind of grassroots entrepreneurship. The same with regards to the tax regime. You know, whether you're a 1-year-old company or a 100-year-old company, you're subject to the same kind of tax regime. That's really not conducive to developing local entrepreneurship, developing local industry. And I think that if, you know, in order to see kind of real growth and development that's not just statistical for the majority of Namibians, but actually has a positive impact on the average Namibian household, we have to be really focused on that grassroots entrepreneurship, grassroots investment, grassroots development.
So in essence, more growth at home strategies then that we're supposed to be looking at.
Well, I'm always cautious when it comes to these sorts of things. So in my mind, it's not so much it's actually a kind of passive activity in many ways. And what we should be looking to do, rather than trying to pick sectors and these sorts of things, is just take the boot off small businesses' neck, make it easier for those small businesses to function without all of these regulatory things. And, you know, there's a number of components to this. It's the regulatory regime, you know, not treating a small business that has very limited possibility for negative externalities and negative impact on other people from operating. It's things like that one-dimensional tax regime. You know, cash flow is so critical for small businesses. If you've made theoretical profit, but you don't have money in the bank and you still have to pay tax, it's very, very difficult for those small businesses. If you have VAT that you need to claim back, it's very difficult for those small businesses. So trying to create an environment that makes it much easier for these small businesses, I think, is key. The other thing is that access to capital is a big thing for small businesses. And access to capital, you know, generally speaking, small businesses around the world, the source of funding for those small businesses is these 3 Fs is what they're called: friends, families, and fools. Now, it's very different if you have friends, families, or you know fools who come from wealthy backgrounds, or if you live in a country where the majority of people have, you know, quite a bit of money. In Namibia, because of our history, because of, you know, many other things, so many of the people that have entrepreneurial spirit and entrepreneurial ideas don't have access to funding because of that, because their friends and family have been excluded in the past, haven't had the opportunities in the past to accumulate wealth. And we need to find ways to overcome that so that those individuals are not held back when it comes to entrepreneurship, when it comes to getting those friend, family, and fools types of monies to get businesses started, to get over those kind of first funding hurdles and similar. And I think that's kind of quite a critical component. But what's very dangerous is that if we take this and we translate it to people in public office, in far-flung offices, often far away from where the entrepreneurs reside and ply their trade, should be picking the sectors, picking the projects, picking the activities, and so on. In my mind, a growth at home strategy is flawed if it doesn't embrace individuals' ideas, if it doesn't embrace and just say, we're going to make it easy for you to take your idea and turn it into a business by not getting in the way, by providing some access to funding, by not having excessive regulation, excessive tax, excessive cash flow pressure on you. But we're not going to try and pick what your company should do, what product you should supply, et cetera, et cetera. If we had asked the Ministry of Trade, for example, what product should Pinehas be producing, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have come up with socks. And they would probably come up with a product that needs endless support from government or similar in order for it to continue to be supplied. The reality is that a room of 10 people, even if they're very smart people, is never going to come up with Uber, Airbnb, much less Gwery Vintage, Shilongo Leather, these sorts of things. We need to leave those decisions to entrepreneurs, and we need to just make sure that the environment for those entrepreneurs is as supportive as possible. But a growth at home strategy where we try to pick what the winners are going to be, that's destined to fail. And I think it's one of the reasons that exact policy has been sort of limited success, let's say.
We are coming to the end of our session today. Roland, out of interest, do you have a pair of Gwery socks, a pair or two or three?
I have quite a few. I have the original ones with the green and yellow print from the ladies in the center of town. Those were my first ones when I wore them through. We actually we need to chat at some point about getting some custom ones for our office. So yeah, we'll do that. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Pinehas, just as we round up things, I just want you to, if there's any sort of entrepreneurial advice that you can give to young people or to new business owners as they, trying to establish themselves in the sector, any advice that you'd like to leave them with?
The best advice I can always give to entrepreneurs out there is being themselves, sticking to their idea. Roland said some very, very important facts, and most of the facts were really hitting home because I could understand what he meant. And sometimes it ends up you having an idea and people are not supporting you and all that. But the most important thing is your idea is important. No matter what, a multi-millionaire comes and tell you, no, move away from socks, focus on t-shirts. My idea is my idea. And if I move away from my idea, then later my business dies. And throughout our process of manufacturing, we always wanted to make sure that we tell the original story. We always want to make sure that we carry a message out there, also a message of hope, also a message that we, as a Namibian country, we are out there in the world. Because sometimes when you travel around the globe and you don't see any representation of Namibia, then you always feel, where is our country? But at least if you see someone in Europe, they have Gwery socks, and then you're like, hey, that's my homeland. So that's the kind of representation we want to have in the world. That's the reason of coming up with this brand. It's not only about manufacturing, but it's about storytelling. So all the product that you come up with, it should have a storytelling, it should make sense to the people. Why am I supporting this kind of product? And I know it's not an easy process. It takes time. It takes you to move mountains. It needs you to make decisions, proper decision. And also one thing, do your research so well. So once you have the research in progress, then it makes easier for you to step in any market that you might want to venture into. Yeah, that's more of it.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. On that note, we've come to the end of our discussion. I just want to say thank you again for joining us. This was a really informative session that we had. And until next time, when we have the hashtag Ask the Expert sessions, it's goodbye from myself and the NMT team. Bye-bye.